The first time Nellie Carver heard Milton Ramsey's voice, she mistook it for the wind moving through the tall grass behind the livery stable, low and unhurried and perfectly certain of where it was going. It was the spring of 1883, and the town of Caldwell, Kansas sat at the edge of the Kishom Trail like a man who had seen too much and decided to sit down anyway. The cattle drive still came through, kicking up red dust that settled on window ledges and the rims of coffee cups, and the saloons stayed lit until the small hours while the churches waited patiently for morning. It was a town that understood contradiction. It held roughness and tenderness side by side the way a good saddle holds a rider, firmly enough to keep everything from flying apart. Nellie had arrived in Caldwell 11 months before the spring that changed everything, coming down from Wichita after the death of her father left her the sole heir to a modest dress and millinery shop that her Aunt Clara had operated on 2nd Street. Clara herself had passed the previous October, and the shop had been closed and shuttered since then, the painted sign above the door fading from green to the pale color of old celery. Nellie was 24 years old, practically minded, and in possession of enough grief to fill a rain barrel but not enough money to afford the luxury of drowning in it. She reopened the shop in June of 1882, rehung the sign, and got to work. She was good with her hands and better with her eyes. She could look at a bolt of fabric and see the dress hiding inside it. She could look at a woman walking through her door and know before a single word was spoken what that woman needed, whether it was a hat with more width in the brim or a collar that would soften the line of a hard jaw. The women of Caldwell came to trust her, and the shop began to breathe again, the little bell above the door ringing with increasing frequency as the months moved on. The trouble with Caldwell, though, was that it was also home to men like Gerald Fitch. Gerald Fitch was not the worst man in Kansas in the year 1883. He was not a murderer or an outlaw. He was something perhaps more ordinary and therefore more exhausting. He was the kind of man who believed very sincerely that the world owed him something, and that if it was slow in delivering, he had every right to reach over and take it. He was 37, a cattle broker with a wide face and a wider opinion of himself, and he had decided somewhere around the previous Christmas that Nellie Carver would make him a fine wife. He had not asked Nellie this. He had simply decided it and begun conducting himself accordingly. He came into the shop on a Tuesday in early March, the bell above the door ringing out of rhythm because he never opened it gently. He removed his hat and set it on the counter without being invited to, and he looked around the shop with the expression of a man appraising property. "Nellie," he said, "not Miss Carver, never Miss Carver. Mr. Fitch," she said without looking up from the pearl buttons she was sorting into a shallow dish. "I've been thinking," he said. "I don't doubt it," she said pleasantly, because pleasantness was a kind of armor she had learned to wear around men like Gerald Fitch. He told her that he'd put a deposit down on a house on Elm Street, a fine house with 2 stories and a parlor that caught the afternoon light, and that it seemed to him like a waste for a woman of her particular qualities to be spending her days in a shop when she could be spending them in a house like that one. He talked for several minutes in this way, and the longer he talked the more Nellie sorted buttons, methodically, pearl into the left dish, bone into the right, and when he finally ran out of words she looked up at him with a very level expression and said that she appreciated his interest, but that she was quite content where she was. His face changed in the way that the sky changes before a storm. "I'm not a man who takes no for a final answer," he said, and his voice had dropped in a way that was meant to be meaningful. "Then I suppose you'll have to practice," she said, and she picked up the pearl dish and carried it to the back room. She heard him leave, the bell jangling sharp and angry above the door, and she stood in the back room for a moment with her hands pressed flat on the work table and let herself breathe. That was a Thursday. The following Monday was when she first truly saw Milton Ramsey. She had gone to the dry goods store on the south end of 2nd Street to collect an order of muslin and thread, and she was coming back along the wooden sidewalk with the bundle under her arm when she heard raised voices from the alley beside the farrier's. She almost kept walking. In Caldwell, raised voices were as common as dust. But something in the particular quality of the shouting made her slow, and she glanced sideways into the gap between the buildings. Gerald Fitch was standing in the alley with two of the men who always seemed to be nearby when he was, large men without much in the way of conversation. They had cornered a man against the back wall of the farrier's shop, and the man they had cornered was holding very still in the way that a person holds still when they have made a careful calculation and determined that stillness is the correct response. He was tall, this man, lean in the way that comes from hard work rather than scarcity, with dark hair going gray at the temples and a jaw that looked like it had been cut from creek stone. He wore a plain brown coat and a hat that had seen real weather, and he did not look frightened. He looked calm in a way that was itself a kind of force. Fitch was saying something in the low, urgent voice he used when he wanted to threaten without technically threatening, and the man against the wall was listening with his full attention in the way that very few people actually listen, taking it all in without reaction. Then the man spoke, and his voice was exactly like Nellie had thought at first, like wind through grass, low and unhurried and carrying a kind of authority that had nothing to do with volume. He said, "I've heard you, Mr. Fitch, and I'll ask you once politely to step back and let me be on my way." Fitch stepped forward instead of back. What happened next was quick and orderly and almost elegant. The man in the brown coat moved in a way that was entirely controlled, and within about 4 seconds Gerald Fitch was sitting on the ground in the alley with a confused expression, and the two large men were standing very still with their hands open and away from their sides. Nobody had fired a gun. Nobody had shouted. The tall man in the brown coat picked up his hat, which had fallen during the brief exchange, settled it back onto his head and walked out of the alley. He almost walked directly into Nellie, who had stopped moving entirely without realizing it. They were very close, close enough that she could see the exact color of his eyes, which was a kind of gray-green, like creek water under clouds. He looked at her with those eyes, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and then he stepped to the side to give her room on the sidewalk and touched the brim of his hat. "Pardon me, ma'am," he said, and walked on. Nellie stood on the wooden sidewalk with her bundle of muslin and thread and watched him go, and she was not a woman who stood watching men walk away as a rule, but she stood there until he turned the corner at the end of the street. She learned his name that evening from Ruth Maddox, who owned the rooming house 2 doors down from the dress shop and knew everything about everyone in Caldwell by the end of their first week in town. Ruth was a comfortable, generous woman of 50 who dispensed information, the way other people dispensed bread, freely, and with the sincere conviction that it would do someone good. Milton Ramsey, Ruth told her, had arrived in Caldwell about 3 weeks prior. He had taken a room at Hanson's boarding house on the north end of town. He was a cattle drover by trade, or had been, having spent the better part of the last decade working the drives up from Texas, but he had some money saved and was apparently looking to settle somewhere, maybe buy a modest piece of land and run a few head of his own. He was 30 years old. He was from a small town in Texas called Castroville, and he'd lost his mother young and been raised partly by his father and partly by hard circumstances. He was quiet, Ruth said, emphasis on the word, the kind of quiet that some people mistook for coldness but wasn't. She'd spoken to him twice at the general store and found him perfectly pleasant. "Has he got a sweetheart?" Nellie asked, and then felt heat rise in her face because she had absolutely not intended to ask that. Ruth smiled the particular smile of a woman who has seen everything and regrets nothing. "Not that anyone's mentioned," she said. Nellie went home and told herself very firmly that she had simply been curious. She was a practical woman. She had a shop to run. She was not in the habit of asking after the personal lives of men she had encountered for approximately 45 seconds in the vicinity of an alley. She thought about his voice for 3 days straight. The next time she saw him was at the church social on the last Saturday of March. The social was held in the yard behind the First Methodist Church, and half the town came out for it because the Methodists made excellent food and nobody wanted to miss the opportunity to stand in the April warm air and talk about their neighbors. Nellie came with Ruth and Ruth's sister-in-law Deborah, a sharp-eyed woman from Ohio who had arrived the previous week and was conducting a thorough assessment of Caldwell with the efficiency of a military inspector. She spotted Milton Ramsey standing near the fence at the far edge of the yard, holding a tin cup and watching the proceedings with the same calm attention she had seen him give Gerald Fitch in the alley. He was not antisocial, she observed. He nodded when people greeted him, shook hands when offered, answered questions. He simply did not force himself into the middle of anything. He waited at the edges and let things come to him. Gerald Fitch was also present, which was unfortunate. He arrived midway through the afternoon with his associate Mr. Baxter, and Nellie saw him scan the yard the way he always did when he arrived somewhere, cataloging and assessing, until his eyes landed on her and stayed there. She engaged Deborah in an extremely focused conversation about quilting, which she found mildly interesting on a good day, and managed to hold Fitch at a distance through sheer social momentum for the better part of an hour. But Deborah was eventually lured away by a plate of corn bread, and Nellie found herself standing alone near the lemonade table with nowhere obvious to go. Fitch materialized at her elbow. "Miss Carver," he said, and the particular way he said it with that low emphasis made her want to step away. "Mr. Fitch," she said. He began talking about the house on Elm Street again. He had put new curtains in, apparently. Blue ones. He thought she would find them becoming. He was speaking quietly for once, not the threatening quiet of the alley but the quiet of a man who knows he has a captive audience and is taking his time about it. And there was something in his manner that had shifted since their last conversation in the shop. He was more certain of himself in a way she couldn't quite account for, and it made the back of her neck prickle. "I think," he said, reaching out to touch the sleeve of her coat, "that you and I should come to an understanding." "I believe I was quite clear about my understanding, Mr. Fitch," she said, stepping back. His hand followed her sleeve. "Nellie," and his voice had that quality again. "The lady said she was clear." The voice came from her left, and it was Milton Ramsey's voice, the low, unhurried one that moved like wind through grass, and he was standing 3 feet away holding his tin cup with exactly the relaxed posture of a man who has stopped by to say hello and has no particular agenda beyond that. His eyes were on Fitch with a quality of attention that was entirely pleasant on the surface and entirely immovable underneath. Fitch turned to look at him. "This doesn't concern you, Ramsey," Fitch said. "No, I don't suppose it does," Milton said agreeably. But it seemed like a good moment to say something anyway. There was a silence. Milton sipped from his tin cup. His expression did not change. It was the most extraordinary thing Nellie had ever seen, this quality of his, this absolute absence of agitation, and she watched Gerald Fitch try to find a foothold in it and fail. Fitch looked at her, then back at Milton, then at her again. "We'll continue this conversation another time," he said to her, with a weight in the words, and then he walked away. Milton watched him go, then turned to Nellie with a perfectly ordinary expression and said, "I apologize for interrupting." "Please don't," she said, and meant it so sincerely that she heard something almost raw in her own voice. He looked at her for a moment with those creek-water eyes, and then the corner of his mouth shifted, not quite a smile but the precursor to one, and he said, "Milton Ramsey." "I know," she said, and then caught herself. "Ruth Maddox mentioned you. I'm Nellie Carver." "I know," he said, and there was a quiet warmth in it that she felt somewhere in the region of her sternum. "You run the dress shop on 2nd Street. I've walked by it 3 or 4 times. The sign is a good color." "It was my aunt's shop," she said. "She had good taste." "Seems like it runs in the family," he said, and he looked away at the yard when he said it, as though he had said something slightly more than he intended and was giving her room to decide what to do with it. She decided to give it the same room he had given it. "Can I get you some lemonade?" she asked. "I'd like that," he said. They stood by the lemonade table for the next hour and talked about Caldwell in Texas, and the quality of the spring that was coming in, and a dozen other things that were not the actual subject of what they were discussing. And at the end of the hour, Nellie knew, with the particular clarity that she had learned to trust, that something had begun. She did not tell herself it was nothing. She was a practical woman, and practical women do not lie to themselves unnecessarily. The following weeks moved with a kind of deliberate sweetness that Nellie had not expected from a town like Caldwell. Milton came into her shop on a Wednesday morning, 10 days after the social, with his hat in his hands, and asked if she might know where a man could get a decent coat made because the one he had was showing its age. She told him she didn't make men's coats as a general rule, but that she could look at it and tell him whether it needed replacing or just some attention. He brought it the next day, and she turned it in her hands and told him it needed the lining replaced and the left cuff let out, and that she could do it for a reasonable price if he had a few days to spare it. He said he did, and she took the coat, and he came back for it 4 days later, and in those 4 days she had also replaced 2 of the buttons with ones that were slightly better quality than the originals, and she hadn't charged him for it. He noticed, the way he seemed to notice everything. "You changed the buttons," he said. "The others were cracked," she said. "You didn't charge me for them." "No." He looked at her with those eyes and said, "That was kind." "It was buttons," she said. "Kindness usually is," he said, and paid her what she asked and thanked her and left, and she stood in the middle of her shop and pressed both hands over her mouth to keep from doing something undignified. He came back the following week on a pretense so thin it was nearly transparent, wanting to know if she sold ribbon because his friend's wife had a birthday and he'd thought of a gift but needed the ribbon to finish it. And she sold him ribbon, and they talked for 40 minutes about nothing in particular, and then he left. And the week after that he came by with no pretense at all, just knocked on the door frame while she was working and said, "Good morning, Miss Carver." And she said, "Good morning, Mr. Ramsey," and she put down what she was doing and they talked. This became the rhythm of things. He came on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, reliably, and stood in the doorway or sat in the chair she had positioned near the window for customers who wanted to discuss their orders, and they talked. He told her about the drives, the long months moving cattle north with nothing but open sky and the smell of dust and cattle and coffee, the particular loneliness of it that was also, he admitted, a kind of freedom. He told her about Castroville, the hills and the cypress trees and the German families who'd settled there, and the particular way the air smelled after rain. She told him about Wichita, about her father who had been a bookkeeper and a very gentle man, about the shop in Wichita where she'd learned to sew at her mother's knee, about Aunt Clara who had smelled of lavender water and talked too fast and was the most loving and difficult woman she'd ever known. She noticed over these weeks the thing about his voice. It never rose. Through all of it, the difficult stories and the funny ones, and the long silences between words when one of them was thinking through something carefully, his voice never climbed. It had the same quality whether he was telling her something sad or something that made him laugh, that low, settled, unhurried quality that felt like something a person could lean against. She noticed it in contrast, too, because Gerald Fitch had not disappeared. He came by the shop twice in April, both times with his voice pitched at a level that was just below what could technically be called yelling, but managed to carry the same pressure. He made it clear that he did not appreciate Milton Ramsey inserting himself into his affairs, and that Nellie would do well to consider her situation in Caldwell carefully, because a woman alone in a town like this depended on the goodwill of men like Gerald Fitch in ways she might not fully appreciate. It was not a threat, technically, but it was the shape of one. She did not tell Milton about these visits, not at first. She did not want to seem like a woman who needed rescuing at every turn, and she also did not want to give Milton a reason to come around her shop that wasn't his own choice freely made. But April wore on, and Fitch's visits took on a quality that grew increasingly difficult to dismiss. He had some influence in Caldwell, more than Nellie had initially understood. He knew the men who controlled the supply routes for several of the small businesses on 2nd Street, and he knew the man who owned the building that Nellie's shop occupied, a man named Calhoun who lived in Wichita and was not personally present, but who was susceptible to pressure from men with cattle money. In the 2nd week of April, Nellie received a letter from Mr. Calhoun informing her that her rent would be increasing by 40% at the start of May. She sat with that letter for a long time. She ran the numbers in her head and then on paper and then in her head again, and the numbers were not encouraging. She could manage it, possibly, if the next few months were good, but it would be tight in a way that left no room for any kind of difficulty. She did not tell herself it was coincidence. On the Thursday of that week, when Milton came by the shop and sat in the chair by the window and asked how she was, she told him the truth. She hadn't planned to, but he asked with the particular quality of attention he always brought to the question, which made it different from the way most people asked, and the truth came out of her before she'd made a conscious decision to release it. She told him about Fitch's visits, about the things Fitch had said, and then about the letter from Calhoun. She kept her voice steady while she talked, which cost her something, and when she finished, Milton was quiet for a moment. He didn't make promises or noise about it. He said, "How much is the increase?" she told him. He was quiet for a moment longer, then he said, "That's Fitch's doing." "Almost certainly," she said. "Do you know who else rents from Calhoun?" She named the shops she was aware of. He nodded slowly. "Calhoun won't want to lose all of them at once." If the other tenants wrote to him together, expressing concern about the increase as a pattern of treatment, it might complicate his arrangement with Fitch. She looked at him. "You think it would work?" "I think Calhoun is a businessman," Milton said. "Businessmen respond to the prospect of losing income. It's not guaranteed, but it's worth trying before anything more complicated." "You've thought about this kind of thing before," she said. He looked at her with a quiet expression. "On the drives, you learned quickly that the loudest solution was rarely the best one. Too many moving parts, too many ways for noise to make things worse." She wrote the letters. Milton helped her with the language, which was direct and dignified, and made a careful argument without accusation. 3 of the other tenants on 2nd Street agreed to sign similar letters, which they composed themselves over the next 2 days with help from Ruth Maddox, who turned out to have very good instincts for the architecture of a persuasive document. The letter from Calhoun that arrived at the end of April revised the increase to 12%, which was still more than she'd been paying but something she could absorb. Fitch was not mentioned in the letter. He didn't need to be. The evening after the second Calhoun letter arrived, Nellie was closing up the shop when she found Milton Ramsey sitting on the bench outside her door in the long golden light of a Kansas evening, not waiting for anything specific, just present in the way he was present, which was completely. "You didn't have to wait," she said. "I know," he said. She sat down next to him on the bench, close enough that she could have reached over and taken his hand, but not so close that she had done it. The street was quiet at this hour, the dust settling, the light going amber and warm across the wooden fronts of the buildings. "Thank you," she said, "for the help with the letters." "You wrote the letters," he said. "You thought of the approach. You would have thought of it yourself," he said, and he said it in the simple way that he said most things, without flattery and without dismissal, just as a statement of what he believed to be true. She turned and looked at him in the golden light, this man sitting beside her on a bench outside her shop in Caldwell, Kansas, who had come into her life 3 weeks ago and rearranged several things without making any noise about it. "Milton," she said. "Yes," he said. She wasn't sure what she had been going to say. She sat for another moment and then said, "Would you like to come to supper? Ruth's making pot roast and she always makes too much." He looked at her, and there was something in his eyes that was warm and careful at the same time, like a fire that knows how important it is not to get out of hand. "I'd like that very much," he said. Supper at Ruth Maddox's rooming house was a full affair. There were 4 boarders plus Ruth, and now Nellie and Milton made 6 around the table, and the conversation was loud and varied and occasionally foolish in the good way that supper conversations sometimes are. Deborah, who had decided to extend her visit indefinitely on the grounds that Caldwell was more interesting than she had initially credited, held forth on the subject of whether the new barbed wire fences going up along the southern range were a civilization or a catastrophe, and 2 of the boarders argued the other side with the energy of men who had opinions and rarely got the chance to express them. And Ruth moved in and out of the kitchen with the efficiency of a general and the warmth of someone who genuinely loved to feed people. Milton sat across from Nellie and was quiet for most of it, not absent but listening, and occasionally he said something that cut cleanly through the noise and reoriented the conversation in a new direction, and then he sat back and let it go where it went. Nellie watched him do this and felt something shift further open in her chest. After supper, when the other boarders had drifted to the parlor and Ruth was washing up, and Deborah had announced she was writing a letter to her husband in Ohio, who would not recognize her anymore because she had become a woman of the frontier, Milton and Nellie ended up on Ruth's front porch in the dark, and the stars over Kansas were extraordinary, the way they always were when the dust had settled and the sky was clear, a whole spilled universe overhead. "I've been thinking about a piece of land east of town," Milton said. He was leaning against the porch rail looking up. "A man named Wheeler wants to sell it. 40 acres. Good grass, a small creek. It's not much, but it's enough to start." "Start what?" she asked. "Something of my own," he said. "I've been working other men's cattle for 12 years. I'd like to work mine." She thought about this. "Are you going to stay in Caldwell then?" He turned and looked at her in the dark, and there was enough moonlight that she could see his face clearly. "I'd like to," he said, "if there are reasons to." The silence after that was very full. "There might be," she said carefully, "reasons to." He nodded slowly, looking at her with that complete attention of his. Then he said, "I don't want to move faster than is right." "No," she agreed, "but I also don't think moving is the same as hurrying." Something in his expression settled, like a thing that had been held gently in the air and was now allowed to rest. "No," he said, "I don't suppose it is." He bought the Wheeler land in the first week of May. It was 42 acres of good Kansas grassland with a creek that ran reliably, and a stand of cottonwood trees along the eastern edge, and a small structure that had been a line shack and could be made into something better. Nellie heard about it from Ruth, who had heard it from the land office, and when Milton came by the shop on Tuesday, she congratulated him and meant it with her whole heart. "Would you like to see it?" he asked. She closed the shop at noon on Wednesday, and he brought a horse for her, a gentle mare named Clara that he'd borrowed from the Hanson stable, and they rode east on a road that turned into a track that opened eventually onto the land itself, and she saw it in the full spring light, the grass moving in the warm wind, the cottonwoods pale and new-leafed along the creek, the sky enormous and blue overhead. She stood with him on his land, and neither of them said anything for a while, and then she said, "It's beautiful." "It needs work," he said. "Everything worth having does," she said. He looked at her sideways with a quality of expression that was very warm, and then he said, "The shack needs to come down and something better built in its place." "What kind of something?" she asked. He described it. It was modest and practical, and it had a south-facing window for the light and a proper kitchen and 2 rooms that could be changed into more rooms over time if things went the way he hoped. He said this last part quietly, with a kind of reserve that was not distance but was the care of a man who wanted to say something real without overstating it. She listened to all of it, and then she said, "It sounds like a home." "That's the hope," he said. They stood in the spring grass with the wind in the cottonwoods for another long while, and then she said, "Milton, I want to say something." "All right," he said. "I'm not a woman who does things by halves," she said. I have a shop that I built back up from nothing, and I have opinions and I know how to use them, and I'm not going to pretend to be simpler than I am because some men prefer it that way." "I know," he said. "I don't prefer it that way. I just wanted to say it clearly," she said. "I appreciate that," he said. "I'll say something clearly, too." He turned to look at her fully in the direct, unhurried way he had. "I've been in a lot of towns, Nellie. I've met a lot of people. And I haven't felt in any of them what I feel when I come to your shop on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, or when I sat next to you on that bench, or when I'm right here on this piece of land talking to you in the spring. I don't know what you call that, but I know it's real, and I know I don't want to let it pass." She looked at him for a long time. The wind moved the grass. The cottonwoods made their light rustling sound. "I don't want to let it pass either," she said. He reached over slowly and took her hand. His hand was rough from years of roping and riding and all the work that came with it, and it was warm, and he held hers with a gentleness that was as deliberate as everything else about him. They stood like that in the May grass until the light began to slant toward afternoon, and then they rode back to Caldwell, and the world had a different quality to it than it had had that morning. Gerald Fitch noticed. He had eyes in Caldwell, the way men with money and wounded pride tend to have eyes, and he did not miss the sight of Nellie Carver and Milton Ramsey riding back into town together, with a particular ease to the way they moved beside each other. He came to the shop the following Monday, and this time he didn't bother with the low, controlled tone. "You're making a mistake," he said, loud enough that Nellie was aware of Mrs. Patterson from the bakery pausing on the sidewalk outside. "I'm going to ask you to lower your voice, Mr. Fitch," Nellie said, with the extreme calm of a woman who has made a decision and is no longer frightened. "I'm trying to do you a courtesy," he said, louder still, "by telling you that Ramsey is nobody. He's a hired hand with some land and no real prospects, and you'd be a fool to—" "Lower your voice," she said again, very quietly, and there was something in the quietness that stopped him for just a moment. "I built something in this town," he said, now at a volume that was merely aggressive rather than theatrical. "I have standing here. I have connections. I can make things very comfortable for a woman who has the sense to, Mr. Fitch." The voice from the door was Milton's, and it was exactly as it always was, low and unhurried and carrying that quality of something immovable beneath it. He was standing in the open doorway of the shop, and he had not raised his voice at all, but it cut through Fitch's words the way a clean line cuts through noise. Fitch turned around. "Ramsey," he said, and his voice was doing the thing it did when he was deciding how to manage a situation. "This is a private conversation." "I can see that," Milton said. "I was walking by and heard it getting louder, thought I'd stop." "Then you can keep walking." Milton leaned against the door frame, unhurried. "What I'd prefer," he said, "is that you finish whatever you need to say to Miss Carver at a volume that doesn't disturb Mrs. Patterson out there, and then give her the same courtesy she'd give you by letting the matter rest." Fitch stared at him. "Or what?" he said, and his voice had gone flat in the way it went when he was genuinely angry. "Or nothing," Milton said simply. "I'm not threatening you anything, Mr. Fitch. I'm just asking you to behave like a man who respects himself enough not to make this kind of scene." It was a strange and precise thing to say, and Nellie saw it land on Fitch like something he couldn't quite deflect, because it wasn't an accusation and it wasn't a challenge. It was an observation, delivered without heat, and it left Fitch with nowhere particular to go. Fitch looked at Nellie for a long moment. Then he put his hat on his head and said very quietly, "This isn't finished," and left. Milton watched him go and then looked at Nellie and said, "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said, and she was. She was entirely all right. She was, in fact, remarkable. "You never raise your voice," she said. He looked slightly surprised by the observation, as though it hadn't occurred to him as notable. "No," he said, "I suppose I don't." "Why?" she asked. Because it was a fair question and she was genuinely curious. He thought about this for a moment in the way he thought about things, properly and without rushing. "My father was a man who raised his voice," he said, "frequently and at length. And I noticed very young that after a certain point, raising your voice mostly just makes everyone around you frightened or angry or both, and you still haven't solved the problem you were trying to solve. You've just made more noise." He paused. And then later on the drives, I learned that the cowboys who could settle a spooked herd were never the ones doing the shouting. The ones doing the shouting made the spooked herd worse. She looked at him standing in the doorway of her shop, this 30-year-old man from Castroville, Texas, who had thought through the nature of his own voice and made something deliberate of it. "And with people," she said. He looked at her with the full attention that always made her feel like the most important thing in any room. "Because you deserve a quiet kind of love," he said simply and without ceremony, and then he looked slightly self-conscious, as though he had said it more plainly than he'd intended. "I mean, a person does. People deserve to feel safe in their own lives." "Yes," she said softly, "they do." She crossed the shop and stood in front of him and looked up at him, and the thing that had been growing between them for these weeks was very present and very real. And she reached up and put her hand against his jaw, and he closed his eyes for just a moment. And then she kissed him, or he kissed her, the way these things work when both people move at the same time. It was a quiet kiss, as it turned out. Very much like the man. She thought about it for the rest of the day and into the evening, and she was not sorry. In the weeks that followed, things between Nellie and Milton moved with the same deliberate sweetness as before, but now it had the warmth of something acknowledged and open, something that was growing in the light rather than in the careful, protected dark of early feeling. He brought her wildflowers from the land east of town. Not grand bouquets, but small handfuls of what was blooming on a given week. The kind of flowers that grew because they wanted to, and not because someone had arranged them. She kept them in a jar on her workbench, and they made the whole shop smell like Kansas in May. He worked the land on the days he wasn't with her, clearing and fencing and working on the structure that he was planning to replace the line shack with. And she went out on Saturday afternoons sometimes and walked the property while he worked, and they talked the whole time he was working, or didn't talk, both of which were equally comfortable. Fitch, true to his word, did not entirely disappear. But his approach changed in May, perhaps because he had made some calculation about the return on investment of direct confrontation, or perhaps because Milton's presence at the edges of things had shifted the cost-benefit of it. He stopped coming to the shop. He contented himself instead with a steady low-grade campaign of social pressure, the kind that worked through suggestion and implication, and the particular way men withstanding in small towns could affect the temperature of a room without doing anything that could be specifically pointed to. He managed to convince 2 of the town's cattle buyers to give Milton cool treatment at the stockyard, which made the business of selling the first few head Milton had bought significantly more complicated. And he said things at the saloon that made their way back to Nellie through Ruth's network of reliable ears, things that were technically observations rather than slanders, about the question of whether a woman running a shop alone really had the kind of stability that Caldwell needed in its commercial district, whether the increased rent had been perhaps an accurate assessment of a lease whose value was uncertain. None of it was devastating, but it had a wearing quality, like weather. It was one evening in June, sitting on the porch at Ruth's after a supper that had included a very fine apple pie and a conversation that had ranged from Kansas statehood politics to the best method for preserving peaches, that Nellie finally said what she'd been thinking for several weeks. "I think Fitch is not going to stop," she said. Milton was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "I don't think so either." "He's not a violent man," she said. "He won't do something that can be brought to the sheriff. But he'll keep applying pressure where he can." "Yes," Milton agreed. "I've been thinking," she said, "that the best response to that kind of pressure is to become so established that it can't take hold." Milton looked at her sideways. "How do you mean?" "My lease with Calhoun is month to month," she said. "It gives Fitch too easy a lever to work. But there's a property on 3rd Street that's for sale outright, the old Halliday building. It needs work, but the bones are good. If I owned the building instead of renting it, Calhoun and Fitch would have nothing to pull on. Milton was quiet, thinking. That's a significant investment, he said. I know, she said. I've run the numbers. I have savings from the last year of the shop, and I have my father's estate, which was modest but not nothing. I can do it if I'm careful, but it would take most of what I have, and it would be a risk. It would also be the right move, he said. She looked at him. Do you think so? I think you're right that Fitch's leverage is the lease, he said. And I think owning a building in a town is a different thing than renting one. It changes what you are in the town. Ruth's brother-in-law is a builder, she said. He's already told Deborah he might stay in Caldwell. He could do the work on the Halliday building. Milton was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I have some money set aside from the land purchase. Not a great deal, but some. I'd like to put it with yours. She looked at him directly. Milton. Not as charity, he said immediately. As an investment in the shop and in Caldwell and in us. If you'll let me. The word us was very careful and very clear and very much his. She sat with it for a moment. She was a practical woman and also a proud one, and she knew the difference between accepting help that diminished you and accepting help that was offered in a spirit of genuine partnership. She looked at his face in the porch light, and she knew exactly which this was. I'll let you, she said. They bought the Halliday building together in July of 1883. With Nellie holding the title because it was her business, and Milton's contribution recorded as a formal loan at terms he'd insisted be written down, so there was no ambiguity, though they both understood that the formality was more for the comfort of the paperwork than for any practical necessity. Ruth's brother-in-law, whose name was Henry Bowen, turned out to be an excellent builder and an even better human being. A man of 40 who worked with the same quiet efficiency as Milton and had strong opinions about the correct way to lay a floor. The work took 2 months. Nellie stayed on 2nd Street while it happened, and in September she moved the shop to 3rd Street, and the new space was larger and better lit, and had a room at the back with a proper door and a window that faced the garden direction. And the sign was freshly painted in the same green her aunt had chosen. And the little bell above the door rang with a clarity that the old one had lost years ago. The opening, if you could call it that, was attended by every woman Nellie counted as a friend in Caldwell, and several she was still getting to know. And Ruth made a cake and Deborah organized the furniture with the efficiency she brought to everything. And Milton came in the late afternoon when the crowd had thinned and stood in the middle of the new shop and looked around at it and then at Nellie. It suits you, he said. It does, she agreed. He stood in the middle of her shop in the September afternoon light, hat in his hands, and said, Nellie, I have something I want to ask you. She was aware of Ruth, who was pretending to arrange a display of hat forms in the corner, going very still. All right, Nellie said. He looked at her with everything he was, this man who had been quiet and steady and present, and who had met her strength with strength of his own and her practicality with a practicality of his own and her care with his own enormous quiet care. I want to build the house on the East Land, he said. I have the plans drawn. I told you about the south-facing window and the kitchen and the rooms that could change over time. He paused. I want to build it for us, for you and me, if you'll say yes. To marrying you, she said. To marrying me, he confirmed. I don't have a ring yet. I wanted to ask first and then get one that you'd actually like, because I suspect you have specific opinions about jewelry the way you have specific opinions about everything, and I didn't want to presume. She laughed, a real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere deep, and Ruth made a sound in the corner that she immediately converted into a cough. That, Nellie said, is possibly the most practical marriage proposal I have ever heard. I'm a practical man, he said, with the not-quite smile she had come to love. Yes, she said, I'll marry you. He let out a breath that told her he had been less certain than he appeared, and she found that she loved him even more for it. Ruth abandoned all pretense and clapped both hands together and said, finally, with a satisfaction that suggested she had been waiting for this outcome since approximately March. They married in October of 1883, on a Saturday with a high blue sky, and the cottonwoods on the east land turning gold along the creek. The ceremony was at the First Methodist Church, performed by Reverend Halsey, who was a kind man with a gift for saying the right words at the right pace. Nellie wore a dress she had made herself from ivory cotton and Belgian lace that Ruth had sent away from a supplier in St. Louis, and it was the finest piece of work she had ever done, precise and beautiful and entirely her own. Milton wore a suit that Henry Bowen had pointed him toward in Wichita, dark gray wool that fit him properly and made his eyes look like creek water on a clear day. The small church was full. The women Nellie had come to know in Caldwell were there, and the other shopkeepers, and Ruth's boarders, and Henry Bowen and Deborah, who had officially decided that Caldwell was now her home, and had written to Ohio to tell her husband to either come or accept that she would visit twice yearly. Milton's side was smaller but not empty. He had a friend from the driving days, a man named Asa Cole, who had come up from Texas for the occasion, a weathered and good-natured man of 34 who cried during the vows and made no effort to hide it. Gerald Fitch was not present. He had sold his cattle interests in Caldwell and relocated to Dodge City the previous month, for reasons that seemed to be entirely his own and unrelated to any specific incident, though the timing was noted by several people who smiled quietly about it. When Reverend Halsey said the words, and Milton looked at her, Nellie felt something settle into its proper place, with a solidity that she had not known she was waiting for. She thought of her father, who had been a gentle man and would have liked this one. She thought of Aunt Clara, who had kept this shop alive through hard years and left it to Nellie like a gift that had unfolded slowly. She thought of every difficult thing she had navigated to get to this morning, and she thought that the difficulty had been worth it because it had brought her here to this church, to this man, to this life. "I do," she said when it was time to say it. He looked at her with everything he had and said, "I do," in the same voice he always used, the low, steady one, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. The house on the East Land was finished by November. Henry Bowen had built it well, with the south-facing window in the parlor and the proper kitchen, and the 2 bedrooms that could be changed over time, and a porch that faced the creek and the cottonwood trees along it. On their first evening in it, after they had arranged what furniture they had and eaten supper at the kitchen table and lit a lamp in the parlor, Nellie stood at the south-facing window and looked out at the last of the day's light on the Kansas grass, and Milton stood beside her and put his arm around her, and they stood like that for a long time without saying anything, because there was nothing that needed to be said that the moment wasn't already saying for them. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was a good one. Not easy, because Kansas winters were not built for ease, but good in the way that the first winter in a real home can be good. Every storm survived together, adding something to the mortar of a life. Milton worked the land when the weather allowed and worked the interior of the house when it didn't, and Nellie ran the shop on 3rd Street through the week and came home on Friday evenings to the house on the East Land, and they settled into the particular rhythm of 2 people who have chosen each other and are discovering what that means in practice. It meant, she learned, that he made coffee at first light and left a cup at her bedside. That he could tell when she'd had a difficult day before she said a word, from some quality in the way she moved, and that his response was always to ask once if she wanted to talk, and, if she said not yet, to simply be present until she did. That he read when she sewed in the evenings, sitting across from each other in the parlor with the lamp between them, and occasionally one of them would read aloud a passage that seemed worth sharing, and they would discuss it for a while and then return to their quiet. It meant that she brought work home sometimes, fabrics and patterns and the particular puzzle of a difficult commission, and that he found this entirely natural and would sometimes ask her to explain what she was solving, genuinely curious, and she discovered that explaining her craft to him helped her see it more clearly. It meant that they argued sometimes, because they were both people with opinions about practical things, about the best way to handle a difficult customer or the wisest moment to expand the cattle herd, and that the arguments were always conducted at a civil temperature and ended with one or both of them conceding something and neither of them carrying it forward into the next day. She asked him once, in February, after a disagreement about something she could no longer remember had resolved itself peaceably, how he always managed to stay at that temperature, not cold but not heated, and he said, "Because I know I might be wrong. And because even if I'm right, being ugly about it doesn't make the right answer more right." She looked at him across the supper table. "You've thought about this very carefully," she said. "I've had good reasons to," he said, and the reference to his father was quiet but clear. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. "I'm glad you came to Caldwell," she said. "So am I," he said, and turned his hand over under hers. In April of 1884, Nellie realized she was expecting their first child, and she sat with the knowledge for 2 days before she told Milton, not because she was uncertain about telling him, but because she wanted to hold it privately for a moment, this new, enormous thing. When she told him, on a Sunday morning on the porch with coffee and the creek running loud with spring melt, he went very quiet for a longer moment than usual, and she watched something move across his face that was too large to be quickly identified. And then he set down his coffee cup and turned to her and pulled her into his arms with a gentleness that was almost unbearably careful. He said, against her hair, "I didn't know it was possible to be this grateful for something." She pressed her face into his shoulder and stayed there. The pregnancy was her own business in many ways, and she ran it with the same practical efficiency she brought to everything, modifying her work schedule as needed and engaging the services of Dr. Aldrich, who had a good reputation and the virtue of treating his women patients like people with functioning minds. She kept the shop going through the summer with the help of a young woman named Clara Adams, whom she hired in June, a 19-year-old with clever hands and a quick mind who had come to Caldwell with her family from Missouri and needed the work. Clara Adams turned out to be one of those happy accidents of hiring that occasionally occur in the lives of people who are paying attention to the right things. She was quick to learn and quietly ambitious, and she treated the craft with respect from her first day, and Nellie found herself teaching with real pleasure, passing on the things her own mother, and then Aunt Clara had taught her, watching them take root in someone new. Their son was born in November of 1884. They named him James, after Nellie's father, and with a middle name of Thomas after Milton's, who had died the previous year. James was born in the house on the East Land with Dr. Aldrich present and Ruth Maddox in the next room boiling water and offering general moral support. And the birth was long and difficult in the way that first births often are but concluded well. And when Nellie held her son for the first time in the lantern light of the bedroom, with the snow falling outside, she looked at this small, extraordinary person and felt something open so completely in her that it would never quite close again. Milton came in and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son with those creekwater eyes, and Nellie watched the thing move across his face again, the enormous thing that was too large to name quickly. "James Thomas Ramsey," Milton said quietly. "Yes," she said. He reached out and touched the baby's hand, and the baby's fingers closed around one of his, and Milton made a sound that was almost nothing, just a breath, but she heard it and she knew exactly what it was. James was a robust and cheerful baby who slept with notable reliability and regarded the world with the calm curiosity of his father. He spent his early months accompanied by the sounds of the shop on 3rd Street on weekdays, where Nellie brought him in a basket, and the sounds of the East Land on weekends, where Milton built a small pen in the corner of the sitting room that allowed James to observe proceedings in safety while his parents moved about their lives. Clara Adams turned out to also have a gift with babies, which was useful, and she and Nellie worked out a practical arrangement for the shop that allowed things to run smoothly through James's first year in a way that Nellie was proud of and felt no need to apologize for, because a woman running a business and raising a child and loving a husband was not doing too many things. She had decided. It was simply living fully. The cattle operation on the East Land grew steadily through 1885. Milton had good instincts for animals and for the particular qualities of Kansas grassland, and he expanded carefully, never faster than the land and his resources could support. He hired a hand in the spring of 1885, a young man named George Sutton, who was 17 coming on 18, from a family in the county who had fallen on hard times, and he taught George the work with the same patience he brought to everything, never raising his voice when something was done wrong, but explaining clearly what the correction was. George turned out to be a hard worker with a genuine affinity for the cattle, and within 6 months, he was an indispensable part of the operation and ate supper at the Ramsey table twice a week, as a matter of comfortable routine. He was also, Nellie noticed, thoroughly smitten with Clara Adams from the shop, and she watched the early stages of that particular dynamic with great fondness and absolutely no intention of interfering. Ruth Maddox came out to the East Land every Sunday for dinner, a habit that had established itself early and been formalized by nobody, but understood by everyone. And Henry Bowen and Deborah often joined them, as Deborah had succeeded in convincing her husband to relocate from Ohio, a man named Warren who turned out to be a bookkeeper of exactly the type that Caldwell had been needing, and who took to the town with a speed that surprised even his wife. These Sunday dinners were the center of something, Nellie thought. They were the accumulation of everything she had built here, all the connections and choices and difficult moments that had resolved themselves into this, a table full of people she loved in a house that was hers on land that was growing, with a baby on a blanket in the corner and a husband who sat at the head of the table and listened to everyone with his full attention, and occasionally said the thing that made everyone laugh or think or both. She watched him across the table on a Sunday in December of 1885, with James on his lap and the whole table talking at once, and she felt that settled feeling again, the one she'd felt in the church on their wedding day, the rightness of it. In the spring of 1886, Nellie discovered she was expecting their second child. She told Milton on the porch again, on a May evening with the cottonwoods leafing out and the creek running, and he pulled her close the same way he had the first time, with the same careful gentleness, and said something that she kept for a long time afterward. He said, "Every good thing in my life has something to do with you," she said. "The same is true for me, you know." He pressed a kiss to her temple and held her in the warm May evening, and she was 30 years old and more herself than she had ever been. James was 20 months old when his sister arrived in December of 1886. They named her Frances Clara, the second name for Aunt Clara, and she was an entirely different child from her brother, small and fierce and vocal from her first moments, announcing her presence with a conviction that made Dr. Aldrich laugh and Milton stand at the foot of the bed looking down at his daughter with an expression of complete and utter helplessness. "She has opinions," Nellie said, tired and happy. "She takes after her mother," Milton said, and it was entirely a compliment. Frances grew up to be exactly what her first moments suggested, a child of intense focus and very strong feelings who could also be, in the right moments, devastatingly sweet. James, at nearly 2 when she arrived, took the role of older brother with a gravity that was his father's and a protectiveness that was both of theirs. The house on the East Land contained multitudes by 1887, and all of them were loud except for Milton, who moved through the center of the noise with the same unhurried quality he had always had, which somehow made the noise around him feel contained and safe rather than overwhelming. The cattle operation in 1887 had grown to 112 head, enough to be called a real ranch rather than a modest holding. George Sutton had been made a proper foreman, and he had indeed, by that spring, gotten up the nerve to call on Clara Adams with the support of what appeared to be the entire social network of Caldwell, Kansas, and she had received his attentions with the particular pleasure of a woman who had been patiently waiting for someone to pay them. Nellie watched this development with great satisfaction and took no credit for it publicly, though privately she considered it one of the finest things she had been adjacent to. The shop on 3rd Street had also grown. Clara Adams had taken on a larger role in the day-to-day operations, as Nellie's family responsibilities shifted the shape of her days, and Nellie had brought in a second seamstress, a woman named Mrs. Haverson who was 45 and had worked in a shop in Denver, and had a range that complemented Clara's developing style beautifully. The shop had a reputation now that extended beyond Caldwell, and Nellie occasionally received orders from women in Wichita and even Kansas City who had heard of it through some thread of recommendation. In the summer of 1887, a letter arrived from Wichita that told Nellie that the property her father had once owned there, a small lot that had been rented since his death, had finally sold, the renters having purchased it, and that she was due a sum that represented the final accounting of her father's estate. It was not a large amount, but it was meaningful, and she sat with it and thought about what her father would have wanted done with it. She told Milton about it that evening, and he listened the way he always listened and then said, "What do you want to do with it?" "I want to put half of it into the ranch," she said, "and half of it into a college fund." He looked at her. "For James and Francis. For James and Francis," she said. "I know it's early. They're not even school age yet, but there's a time coming when the territories will have proper colleges and women will go to them the same as men, and I want Francis to be able to go if she wants to." Milton was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I think your father would have liked that." "I think he would have," she said. "And the ranch half," he said. "I want to build a proper barn," she said. "The current structure is too small for the herd we're going to have by next year." He nodded. "Henry Bowen is available this fall." "I know," she said and smiled. He shook his head with the not-quite smile. "You've already spoken to him." "I wanted to know if he was available before I proposed it," she said reasonably. He reached over and tucked a strand of hair back from her face very gently and said, "Nellie, you are the most organized woman I have ever met." "Is that a complaint?" she asked. "No," he said. "It is an absolute wonder." Henry Bowen built the barn that autumn, and it was a fine barn, solid and capacious, and the ranch grew into it comfortably over the next season. George Sutton and Clara Adams were married in February of 1888, in the same church where Nellie and Milton had married, and the reception was held at the Bowen house because it was the largest suitable space in Caldwell, and it was a genuinely joyful evening that Ruth Maddox afterward declared the best party she had been to in 30 years, which was not idle flattery, because Ruth had been to a very great many parties. By the spring of 1888, the Ramsey Ranch had grown to a point where it represented a real and established presence in the county. The shop on 3rd Street was a known and respected business. James was 3.5, and in possession of his father's unsettling calm and his mother's total certainty about what he thought, which combination was already making the adults in his life suspect that he would be a remarkable man. Frances was 16 months and walking with a confidence that suggested she considered the world entirely navigable, which she demonstrated by attempting to climb everything in her environment, including the fence between the yard and the creek, which required some ongoing negotiation. One April afternoon, on a day warm enough to have the windows open, Nellie was working in the parlor on a particularly intricate piece of embroidery intended for a collar while James played on the floor and Frances slept upstairs, and Milton came in from the field earlier than expected, his boots dusty and his hat pushed back on his head, and sat down in the chair across from her with the expression of a man who has been thinking about something for a while. "What is it?" she said without looking up from her work. "A man came to the ranch today," he said. "A buyer from Abilene. He made an offer on the whole herd." She looked up. "The whole herd." "He wants to expand his operation and he likes the quality of the stock." Milton leaned back in the chair, thinking, "The offer is good. Do you want to take it?" she said. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I've been running cattle since I was 18 years old. I don't know what I'd do without them." "You'd still have the land," she said. "You could start again at a smaller scale, build a different kind of herd, take your time about it. Or I could decline and keep growing what we have," he said. She looked at him for a moment, knowing exactly what he needed from her. Not a decision, but a witness, someone to think alongside. "What does your gut say?" she asked. He was quiet for a long moment. James looked up from his blocks and then went back to them. "It says the offer is very good," Milton said slowly, "and that I've been pushing the herd size because I could, not because it was exactly the shape of what I wanted, and that a smaller herd better managed might be the right answer." "Then take the offer," she said. He looked at her. "Or don't," she said. "But you already know what you think. You just said it." He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "I think I'll take the offer." "I think that's right," she said, and went back to her embroidery. He took the offer. He sold the herd to the man from Abilene in May of 1888 and used part of the proceeds to retire the formal loan on the building, and part of it to purchase a smaller selection of high-quality breeding stock, a different and more considered approach than the steady expansion of previous years. George Sutton, who had his own stake in how the operation ran, was part of these conversations from the beginning and helped shape the new direction with his characteristic combination of practical knowledge and genuine investment. By the summer of 1888, the Ramsey Ranch had become a different thing than it had been, smaller in raw numbers but more deliberate, and Milton moved through it with a quality of satisfaction that Nellie recognized, because it was the same quality she'd seen in him on that spring day in 1883, when he'd stood on 42 acres of good Kansas grass and described the house he was going to build. Ruth Maddox turned 60 in July of 1888, and the celebration was held on a Saturday at the East Land, on the grass outside the house, with lanterns strung between the cottonwoods and tables set end to end along the porch, and everyone came. The whole of Caldwell, it seemed, had been touched by Ruth in one way or another, had been fed by her or helped by her or listened to by her, and the evening was warm with it, warm with the particular light of a community acknowledging one of its best members. Late in the evening, when the children were asleep inside and the adults were sitting in the lantern light with whatever was left of the food, and the conversation had gone to the comfortable wandering kind that happens at the end of good parties, Nellie sat next to Milton on the porch steps and leaned against his shoulder and looked out at the lantern-lit yard and all the people she loved in it. "I was thinking today," she said quietly, "about the day I arrived in Caldwell." "What were you thinking about it?" he said. "That I arrived with a trunk and a grief and a set of bolt cutters my father had put in the trunk at the last minute because he said a woman alone should have a way to open things that have been locked against her," she said. Milton's shoulder moved with a quiet laugh. "And now look," she said. "Now look," he agreed. She turned her head and looked at him. This man who had been sitting beside her for 5 years, who had held her hand in the spring grass and stood in her shop doorway and helped her write letters, and never once in any of it raised his voice at her. "I love you," she said, because it was true, and because some things should be said even when they're known. He turned and looked at her with those eyes, gray-green and steady, and said, "I love you," in the voice that was like wind in grass, low and certain, and going exactly where it meant to go. James appeared at the screen door behind them in the particular way of small children who have been put to bed and have decided against it, his dark hair sticking up and his expression one of total composure. "I cannot sleep," he said. "You haven't tried long enough," his father said without turning around. "I tried very long," James said. "Come out here then," Nellie said, and James opened the screen door and came out and fit himself between his parents on the porch step with the ease of a child who has always known this space was his, and the three of them sat in the lantern light while the party continued in the yard, and the cottonwoods were still and dark above the lanterns. James fell asleep between them 20 minutes later. Milton lifted him gently and carried him inside, and Nellie followed, and she watched her husband settle their son into his bed with the same careful gentleness he applied to everything, pulling the quilt up and brushing the dark hair back from the small forehead. And she stood in the doorway of her son's room and thought that a person could spend a whole life looking for this and not find it. And she had found it in a Kansas town in the spring of 1883, when she'd stood on a wooden sidewalk watching a man in a brown coat walk around the corner at the end of the street. In the autumn of 1888, there was a third pregnancy, and this one surprised them both with its timing if not its welcome. Nellie ran the numbers with her usual efficiency and determined that she could manage all of it, the shop and the children and the ranch and the expanding social infrastructure of their lives. And she did. She reduced her hours at the shop and gave Clara more responsibility, which Clara accepted with exactly the professional confidence Nellie had hoped to see in her. And she managed the pregnancy through a winter that was genuinely cold with the practical warmth of a woman who has everything she needs. Their second son was born in June of 1889. They named him Henry, for Henry Bowen, who had built their home and who cried openly at the announcement and was visibly flattered for weeks. Henry Ramsey arrived with the same vocal conviction as his sister Frances, which suggested certain things about the future of the household. James, at 4.5, examined his new brother with the systematic attention of someone taking inventory, and then announced his assessment, which was that Henry seemed acceptable and that he would help teach him things. "That's very kind of you," Milton told him. James nodded with the gravity of a man accepting a responsibility. The summer of 1889 was a fine one. The ranch ran smoothly under the new model. George Sutton had found his footing in the adjusted role and was growing into it every month, and the shop on 3rd Street was the most successful it had ever been. Nellie sat on the porch in the long summer evenings with baby Henry, while Frances toddled in the grass and James supervised her toddling with his characteristic watchfulness, and Milton came in from the ranch at the end of the day and sat beside her. And everything that had been built was around them, and it was enough, more than enough. It was exactly right. On one of those evenings, Nellie asked him something she had been turning over for a while. "Do you ever miss the drives?" She said he thought about it properly the way he did. "Sometimes I miss the sky," he said, "the way it was on the open trail. No trees, no buildings, just that enormous sky and the sound of cattle moving and the smell of grass and dust." He paused. "But missing it doesn't mean I want it back. Some things are beautiful and you can hold them in the past without needing them in the present." She looked at him. "That's very wise," she said. "I've had good teachers," he said, and looked at her sideways in the way that meant she was one of them. The years moved on with the particular quality of years that are full, not always easy but fully inhabited. 1890 brought a hard drought that tested the ranch and everyone around it, and they managed it carefully and came through thinner but intact. And the following year the rains returned and the grass grew back and the herd recovered. The shop navigated the economic pressures of the decade with the same care, and Clara became a true partner in it in all but the formal title, which Nellie addressed in 1892 by offering her a formal partnership arrangement, which Clara accepted with a composure that she later admitted to Nellie had cost her considerable effort to maintain. James started school in 1891, walking the road into Caldwell with his father in the mornings, with the composure of someone who has decided that school is a reasonable undertaking and intends to do it properly. He was an excellent student and a difficult one for his teachers, in the sense that he asked questions of such precise inconvenience that they required the teachers to know their subjects thoroughly, which not all of them did. Ruth Maddox said he was going to be a lawyer. Nellie thought possibly a doctor. Milton said he would be whatever he decided to be, and that the deciding was the interesting part. Frances started school 2 years later, and immediately found it insufficient for her energies, and began supplementing it with an independent reading program that she conducted in the shop's back room on Saturday mornings, working through whatever Nellie or Milton could obtain for her from the bookseller in Wichita. She was a child of enormous appetite for knowledge and zero patience for the pace at which it was typically delivered, and the adults in her life loved her for it, and managed the frustration it occasionally caused with a combination of strategy and humor. Henry was, at 3 and 4 and 5, the most gregarious of the three children, with a facility for charming everyone around him that was deployed with what appeared to be entirely unconscious skill. He made friends the way water makes its way downhill, without apparent effort but with absolute persistence, and the Ramsey yard on any given Saturday afternoon in the early 1890s was typically populated by an assortment of neighboring children and at least 2 dogs, and occasionally a goat of indeterminate ownership. The community they had built in Caldwell deepened through these years. Ruth Maddox remained the social and moral center of their particular circle, organizing and caring and feeding, and observing with unchanged intensity into her 60s. Henry Bowen and Deborah were fixtures of the Sunday dinners. George and Clara Sutton had 2 children of their own by 1892, a boy named Milton, which was both an honor and a source of considerable amusement, and a girl named Nellie Francis, which caused the original Nellie to have to go into the back room for a moment to collect herself. Asack Cole, Milton's friend from the driving days, came through Caldwell every year or 2 on his way somewhere and always stayed for a week, sleeping in the barn with George's cheerful permission, and eating at the Ramsey table every night, and telling stories about the trail that the children absorbed with total attention. He was the physical evidence of the life Milton had lived before Caldwell, and Nellie was glad for him, glad for the continuity he represented. In the autumn of 1894, James turned 10. He was a boy who looked startlingly like his father in the physical arrangement of his face, but who moved through the world with the combined force of both his parents, the quiet steadiness of Milton, and the practical precision of Nellie. And he had begun, that year, to help with the ranch in earnest on weekends, working alongside George with a seriousness that earned him respect from the ranch hand who had known him his whole life. On James's 10th birthday, Milton gave him his own horse, a young gray gelding named Dust, chosen by James after a consideration so thorough that it had taken 2 visits to the stable. The look on the boy's face when Milton put the lead rope in his hands was one of the things Nellie kept in the collection of images that she would carry for the rest of her life, a 10-year-old's face with everything in it, the love and the gravity and the barely contained joy. "Take care of him," Milton told James. "I will," James said, with his father's absolute certainty. Milton looked at Nellie over their son's head, and she smiled at him across the stable, and he smiled back, the full real smile that not everyone saw but that she always felt like a gift. That same autumn, Nellie was asked by several women in Caldwell to help organize what would become the town's first women's civic association, a group dedicated to practical improvement of Caldwell's shared life. From the condition of the school building, to the availability of medical services, to the question of what the town's young women were supposed to do with their intelligence and ambition in an era that was changing but not fast enough. She agreed and threw herself into it with her usual efficiency, and within a year the association had 30 members, and had successfully lobbied for a second teacher at the school and begun collecting funds for a lending library. Milton attended the organizational meeting as her guest and sat in the back and listened to an hour and a half of women discussing the civic infrastructure of Caldwell with focused intelligence, and on the way home he said, "That was one of the most interesting evenings I have spent in some time." "More interesting than a cattle auction," she said. "Considerably," he said. She laughed and took his arm on the road home, and the night was full of stars over Kansas, the same enormous sky he described from the drives, and it was all around them and it was wonderful. By 1896, the shop on 3rd Street was officially the Carver Sutton Millinery and Dress, reflecting the partnership of Nellie and Clara, and it was one of the better-known dress shops in a radius of 100 miles. The Women's Civic Association had the lending library it had been working toward, operating out of 3 shelves in the town hall with a collection that had been assembled through donations and 2 targeted purchasing drives, and now numbered nearly 400 volumes. Frances Ramsey, who was 9, was its most frequent visitor and had read her way through roughly a third of it. George Sutton, grown fully into his foreman role, had used his savings to purchase a small adjacent piece of land, and the Ramsey and Sutton operations now worked in easy coordination, which benefited both. The professional collaboration had deepened the friendship between the two families into something that felt less like friendship and more like family, in the way that some things become over enough time and shared difficulty. In the summer of 1897, Ruth Maddox fell ill. It was not sudden, which in some ways made it harder to receive than sudden would have been. A gradual dimming of her considerable light over several months that everyone who loved her watched, with the kind of helplessness that accompanies the things that cannot be fixed. She was 68 years old, and she had lived with total fullness, and she knew it, and she spent her last months being cared for in the way she had spent decades caring for others, receiving the attention with a grace that did not pretend the disease away, but did not surrender to it either. Nellie went to her every day. She sat with her and talked and read to her when Ruth was up for it, and simply sat when she wasn't. And the conversations they had in those months were some of the most important of Nellie's life, the kind that happen when time has been acknowledged as finite, and therefore every word carries its proper weight. Ruth died in September of 1897, on a quiet morning, and the grief in Caldwell was real and wide and spoke to what she had been to the place. The funeral was attended by more people than the church could hold, and people stood outside in the September morning and listened through the windows, and Reverend Halsey, who had married Nellie and Milton, and who had buried enough people to know how to speak to what it meant to lose someone irreplaceable, said everything that needed to be said. Nellie stood beside Milton in the pew, and he held her hand throughout, and when it was over and they were outside in the air, she stood for a moment with her face turned up to the September sky and let herself feel the full weight of it before she put it in the place where she would carry it. "She was the first person in this town who made me feel that I belonged here," she said. "I know," he said. "I want to make sure the lending library has a proper name on it," she said. "The Ruth Maddox Lending Library." "I'll speak to the Civic Association," he said. "So will I," she said. "But yes." He put his arm around her and they stood together in the September morning. The lending library was formally named for Ruth Maddox before the end of the year, and a small brass plaque was installed above the door of the room in the town hall that the collection had by then expanded to occupy. And at the little ceremony for it, Frances Ramsey, who was 10 years old and who had loved Ruth with the directness of a child who recognized quality, gave a short speech that she had written herself, and that was so precisely right in every word that it reduced Warren Bowen to tears, which was a difficult thing to do to a man from Ohio. The years following Ruth's death had the quality that years do after you lose someone who was a center of gravity, a slight reorientation, the community finding its new balance. The Ramsey family found theirs. James was 13 by 1898, and moving through the world with the controlled purposefulness of someone who had been thinking seriously about who he was going to be and had begun making decisions accordingly. He was talking about medicine, in the way that teenagers talk about futures they have not yet committed to, but with an underlying seriousness that suggested it was more than just talk. Frances, at 11, was a small hurricane of intellectual energy, who had exhausted the lending library's collection in her areas of interest, and had begun writing letters to Deborah Bowen's contacts in Ohio requesting recommendations for further reading, which she received with a thoroughness that surprised everyone except Nellie. Henry at 8 was the glue, in a manner of speaking, the social intelligence of the household, the one who always knew who needed what kind of attention, and who had a gift for providing it so naturally that people rarely noticed they were receiving it. Milton watched his 3 children with a wonder that he rarely put into words, but that Nellie could read in him the way she could read everything about him now. After 15 years of this life they had built together. She watched him watch them, this man who had been raised by hard circumstances and who had made something entirely different from what he'd been given, and she thought that she had never loved anything the way she loved the fact of him. In the spring of 1899, James won a scholarship to the University of Kansas Medical School preparatory program in Lawrence. It was not formally called a scholarship. It was a competitive entry program with a stipend for exceptional students from rural counties, and James had applied for it the previous autumn with the methodical seriousness he brought to everything, and had been notified of his acceptance in March. He was 14, young but permitted given his preparation, and the family sat around the supper table with the letter passed from hand to hand and discussed it with the thoroughness the situation deserved. James said he wanted to go. Milton asked him 3 questions, careful ones, about what he thought it would be like and what he would miss and what he expected to find. James answered all 3 honestly, including the part about being frightened, which he admitted with his father's characteristic lack of drama about difficult truths. Being frightened is appropriate, Milton told him. It means you understand the size of what you're doing. Will you come visit? James asked, which was a 14-year-old's question underneath the composure. Every chance we get, Nellie said, and meant it absolutely. James left for Lawrence in August of 1899. The morning he went, his father put both hands on his shoulders and looked at him for a long moment, and then pulled him into an embrace that said everything a man can say when he doesn't want to make a noise about it. And James, for once, did not maintain his composure entirely, which was exactly right. Frances said goodbye with a list of books she wanted him to request from the university library on her behalf. Henry cried without any self-consciousness whatsoever, which made James cry too, which made the departure both harder and better. The house on the East Land was quieter with James gone, and Nellie moved through that quietness and found that it held a different kind of fullness, the fullness of a life that had grown so much that even its absences had weight. She wrote to James every week, letters that were practical and warm and full of news, and he wrote back with a regularity that she attributed to his essential good character, and to the fact that she had made very clear that the regularity was expected. The century turned in 1900, and Caldwell, Kansas stood on the other side of it still itself, changed by the years as everything is but still recognizable as the place where Nellie Carver had arrived with a trunk and a grief in 1882. The cattle drives were different now, the railroad having changed the shape of things, and the town had adjusted its identity accordingly, and the dust that still settled on window ledges was the same dust it had always been. Milton was 47 in 1900, a man in the full ease of himself, the gray at his temples having spread to give his dark hair a salt and pepper quality that Nellie found unreasonably attractive, and said so without embarrassment because they had been married 17 years, and she saw no reason to be coy about it at this stage. She was 41, and the shop on 3rd Street was 18 years old under her hand, and she was more deeply herself than she had ever been, the way some people get when they have lived fully in the life they have chosen. On a May morning in 1900, they rode out to the east edge of the land together on horseback, as they did sometimes, to a rise that let you see a long way, and they sat on their horses in the warm May air, and looked at the spring grass moving and the creek glinting and the cottonwoods in their new leaves and the ranch buildings visible in the middle distance. And Nellie thought about the spring of 1883 when she had stood on this land for the first time, and he had described what he would build here. Everything he had described existed. The south-facing window was there, and the kitchen, and the rooms that had changed over time to accommodate the children and the life that had grown in them. The barn Henry Bowen had built stood solid on the east side. The creek ran as it always had. The cottonwoods were 17 years older and magnificent. "You built it," she said. He looked at her. "We built it," he said. She looked at him in the May morning light, her husband of 17 years, and she felt the same thing she had felt on their wedding day and in the church and on the porch in the lantern light, that settled rightness, that thing being in its correct place. "I'm going to ask you something," she said, "and I want you to answer it honestly." "I always do," he said. "Are you happy?" she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the land, and then he turned and looked at her with those Creekwater eyes that she had first seen in 1883 from a distance of about 6 inches on a wooden sidewalk in Caldwell, Kansas. "There has not been a single morning," he said quietly, "when I woke up in that house and didn't know that I was exactly where I was meant to be, that I had the life I was meant to have." He paused. "Yes, Nellie, I am happy." She looked at him for a long moment. This quiet man who had loved her without noise or performance for 17 years, who had stood in doorways and sat on benches and held her hand in spring grass and built a house and raised children and never once raised his voice. "Good," she said. "So am I." They rode back down the rise toward the house, side by side in the warm May morning, and the grass moved around them in the wind, and the sky was the enormous Kansas sky, and everything that had been built was below them, settled and real and fully theirs. James came home from Lawrence for the summer that year, taller and more certain of himself, and full of the particular energy of a young person who has been studying something that has confirmed they are in the right place. He walked the ranch with his father and helped with the summer work and ate at the table with the whole family for 3 months, and at the end of the summer, he went back to Lawrence, and Nellie stood on the porch and watched him go down the road, and felt the particular love that is specific to watching your children walk toward their futures. Frances started secondary school in 1901 and immediately began campaigning for the right to attend university when the time came, which nobody in her family contested, because they had all seen it coming for approximately 6 years. Henry was 12 and had developed a serious interest in the ranch's cattle management, following George Sutton around with the focused attention of someone who has found their subject. And George, who had a gift for teaching that he'd learned partly from watching Milton, was an excellent guide for it. Milton, in 1901, did something that Nellie had not expected but recognized immediately as perfectly like him. He began visiting the school in Caldwell once a week, voluntarily, to help with a practical skills class that one of the teachers, a young woman named Miss Garrett, had begun for the older students, covering things like land assessment and animal husbandry and basic carpentry, and what Milton called the practicalities of staying alive in a place like Kansas. He did it without announcement and without self-congratulation, simply showed up on Tuesday mornings and helped, and within a few months the Tuesday class was the most attended in the school. Nellie heard about it from Miss Garrett, not from Milton. She brought it up at supper. "Why didn't you tell me?" she said. He looked up from his plate. "Tell you what? About the school. Miss Garrett told me you've been going every Tuesday." "Ah," he said, "I didn't think it was particularly remarkable." "It is, though," she said. "Someone should teach them," he said. "They're good students." She looked at him across the supper table, her husband, and thought about the first time she had heard his voice and mistaken it for wind. "You are," she said, "a genuinely good man, Milton Ramsey." He looked slightly uncomfortable, the way he always did with direct praise, and Frances looked up from her meal and said, "She's right, Papa," with the authority of a 12-year-old who considers herself a reliable assessor of character. Henry nodded in agreement from his side of the table. Milton looked at his family and then at Nellie and said, with the not-quite smile she had loved for nearly 20 years, "I'm grateful for good company." In 1904, James completed his medical training and came home to Caldwell as a doctor, which was a fact that required several weeks of collective adjustment, because the town had known him since he was a baby in a basket on Nellie's workbench, and there was something simultaneously entirely natural and entirely astonishing about the word doctor being applied to this person they all remembered in that context. He joined the practice of Dr. Aldrich, now considerably older but still practicing with a stubbornness that suggested he intended to do so, until circumstances became literally prohibitive. And the two of them together covered the medical needs of Caldwell and the surrounding county, with a competence that the community recognized and was grateful for. James was 20 in 1904, a young man who had his father's measured quality and his mother's precise intelligence, and who moved through the world with the ease of someone who had been well loved, and had therefore learned what it felt like to trust people. He was not yet in a relationship, a fact that Ruth's rooming house, now run by a niece of Ruth's named Sylvia, had opinions about and expressed freely. James received these opinions with his father's quality of pleasant immovability. Frances was 18 in 1904, and the question of university had been resolved the year before. She would go to the Kansas State Normal School in Emporia, which had been accepting women students for some years, and had a curriculum that interested her, specifically the teaching of literature and the emerging field of what she called the education of minds that don't move in straight lines. She left in September of 1904 with 3 trunks and a list of books, and a confidence that was not bravado, but the straightforward certainty of someone who has been prepared for this by parents who understood exactly what preparation meant. Henry at 15 was already as capable on the ranch as many grown men, a fact that George Sutton reported to Milton with a combination of professional respect and the warmth of a man watching a boy he'd known since birth become someone remarkable. He had his mother's organizational intelligence applied to the practical world of cattle and land management, and he was beginning to have ideas about how the ranch might develop further that were worth discussing seriously. On a Sunday in October of 1904, with James home for the day and Frances newly gone to Emporia and Henry spending the afternoon with George going over some fencing calculations, Nellie and Milton sat on the porch in the autumn afternoon with coffee, which they still did, which they had done since the beginning. "When did it happen?" she said. He looked at her sideways. "When did what happen?" he said. "All of this," she said, with a gesture that encompassed the house and the land and the October sky and the life that had accumulated around them. "It feels like yesterday that I was sorting buttons in a shop on 2nd Street, and a man in a brown coat came around the corner at the end of the street. I remember that day," he said. "Do you?" she said. "I remember the sidewalk," he said, "and that you were holding a bundle of fabric and you were looking at me like you were trying to figure something out." "I was," she said. "Did you figure it out?" he asked with the not-quite smile. "Eventually," she said. He reached over and took her hand, the way he had in the spring grass of 1883, with the same deliberate gentleness, and she turned her hand over under his the way she had then. "I want to tell you something," he said. "All right," she said. He looked out at the October land, the grass gone gold, the cottonwoods in their full autumn color along the creek. This land he had bought for 42 acres and a hope, and had tended for 21 years. "When I came to Caldwell," he said, "I didn't have a clear picture of what I was looking for. I knew I was tired of moving. I knew I wanted land, but I didn't have a picture of the rest of it." He was quiet for a moment. "And then I ran into a woman on a sidewalk who was trying to figure something out about me, and everything I didn't have a picture of came into focus." She looked at him, this man with the gray-green eyes and the voice like wind in grass, sitting beside her on the porch of the house he had built for her. "That is the most romantic thing you have ever said to me," she said. "I have 21 years' worth of material," he said. "I'm pacing myself." She laughed, the full real laugh, and held his hand, and the October afternoon was golden around them. James was married in 1907 to a woman named Grace, a schoolteacher from Wichita who had come to Caldwell to help Miss Garrett, now Miss Garrett Warren, with the expanding school, and who had met James in the particular way that two people meet when they are both the kind of person who arrives early and stays late and takes things seriously. They were married in June, in the same church, by a reverend who had succeeded Reverend Halsey, and it was a day of genuine happiness for everyone concerned. Nellie made Grace's dress because there was no other possible arrangement, and it was perhaps the finest piece of work she had ever done, which was saying something. Frances came back from Emporia in 1908, completed, which was how she put it, meaning she had her certificate and her ideas, and was ready to put them into the world. She started teaching at the Caldwell School the following autumn, and within 2 years she had reorganized the reading curriculum and begun a program for the students who struggled with conventional instruction that was innovative enough to attract attention from educators in Wichita. Henry, who had turned 20 in 1909, took over the day-to-day management of the Ramsey Ranch that year in a formal arrangement that Milton had proposed, and Henry had received with a gravity that acknowledged the weight of it. George Sutton was 60 by then and still working, but in a reduced capacity, and the operation under Henry's management grew in the deliberate way that Milton had always managed it, not faster than the land could support, with careful attention to quality over quantity. In 1910, Nellie and Milton's first grandchild was born. James and Grace named their son William, and he arrived in February with his father's eyes and his mother's voice, and the full attention of 4 grandparents who had nothing but time for him. Nellie held William in the kitchen of James and Grace's house in Caldwell and looked at him, this new person, and felt the generation of it, the way life keeps building forward, each thing enabling the next. She was 51 years old, and she was so far from the woman who had arrived with a trunk and a grief in 1882 that she could barely see that woman from where she stood. And yet she knew she was entirely her, the same essential person who had sorted buttons with her head down and kept her voice steady and made a life from what she had. Milton was there too, standing beside her in the kitchen, looking at his grandson with his full attention, and she looked at his profile, the creekstone jaw and the gray-green eyes and the dark hair now mostly silver at the temples and through it. And she thought that he had not changed, not in the things that mattered, not in the 27 years since a spring day in Caldwell when he had taken her hand in the tall grass and held it with such deliberate gentleness. She took his hand now in James and Grace's kitchen, with their grandson making the small sounds of new life, and he turned and looked at her. No words were necessary. In the spring of 1911, Nellie turned the shop over to Clara Sutton formally and completely, retaining a small advisory role that was more affection than function, and she did it with the clean hands of someone who knows when a thing has been finished and can let it go. The Carver-Sutton millinery and dress was Clara's now, and she wore it as confidently as anything she had ever made. What Nellie did instead was right. She had been making notes for years, in the margins of ledgers and in small journals she kept in the desk in the parlor, about the work and the life and the town, and she began in 1911 to shape these into something longer, a record of what Caldwell had been in the years she had known it, what the women who had built their lives here had accomplished, what the place looked like from the inside of a dress shop on 3rd Street over the better part of 3 decades. She wrote in the mornings at the kitchen table while the coffee cooled and Milton was outside with Henry, and she wrote without rushing, the way he did everything, because she had learned that from him over 28 years, and she thought it was probably the most useful lesson she had ever received. By 1913, James had delivered 12 children in the county and lost his original mentor, Dr. Aldrich, who had finally retired at the age of 79 with a stubbornness that had become legendary, and James's practice was the primary medical care for a radius of 30 miles. Grace taught 2nd grade at the Caldwell School with a warmth and precision that made her the parent of half the town's children in the way that good teachers become. William was 3, and a menace, and a delight. Frances had by 1913 gained a reputation in the state educational community for her work with struggling students that had resulted in invitations to speak at 3 conferences, and a correspondence with a woman in Chicago who was doing similar work in a very different context. She was not married and did not appear particularly preoccupied with the question, being, as she had always been, primarily occupied with the work. Henry Ramsey married in 1914, a woman named Pearl who was 23 and the daughter of a neighboring rancher, and who turned out to have opinions about cattle management that were correct and expressed without hesitation. And the first time she and Henry disagreed about something in front of the family, Milton watched the exchange with an expression that was quietly delighted, and afterward told Nellie that Henry had done very well for himself. "She's exactly right about the winter grazing rotation," Nellie said. "I know," Milton said. "So does Henry. He's just working up to saying so." He did say so by the following day, and it was handled with exactly the kind of equanimity that comes from two people who respect each other and are interested in being right more than in being seen to be right. By the summer of 1915, Nellie had finished her manuscript. She called it simply a record because that was what it was, and she sent it to a woman in Kansas City who had expressed interest in publishing work about the frontier era from women's perspectives. And in February of 1916, she received a letter of acceptance. The book was published in 1917 under the title she had chosen, which was about the women who had built Caldwell from the inside out, and it was reviewed with attention that surprised and did not entirely surprise her. She read Milton the acceptance letter across the kitchen table on the February morning it arrived, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when something had moved him. "Your aunt would have been proud," he said. "My father too," she said. "So am I," he said. She folded the letter and held it and looked at him across the table that they had eaten at together for 34 years, and she felt the full span of it. All the mornings and evenings and difficult weeks and wonderful weeks and the ordinary days between them. All of it held in this man who sat across from her with his coffee and his quiet and his complete and steady love. In 1920, Nellie was 61 and Milton was 67, and the town of Caldwell had electricity in most of its buildings and an automobile on Main Street that Henry's son, born in 1916, and named James after his uncle, regarded as the most interesting object in the world. The ranch operated with the same deliberate care it always had, and Frances was teaching at the Kansas State Normal School herself by now, her work having taken her full circle back to where she had been educated, and James had been joined in his medical practice by a young doctor named Peter who had come from Topeka and who intended, he said, to stay in Caldwell as long as it would have him. On a September evening in 1921, Nellie and Milton walked out to the rise on the east edge of the land the way they sometimes did, on horseback still, because they had both maintained that habit against the advice of no one in particular. They sat on their horses in the September dusk and looked at the land below them, the ranch buildings and the house with the south-facing window and the creek and the cottonwoods, which were very large trees now, and had the grandeur of things that have been standing for a long time in a place that has treated them well. The sky was doing the thing it did at that hour, turning from blue to the color of embers along the western horizon, and the grass was the dry gold of late summer and moved in the evening wind. "I've been thinking," Milton said. "What about," she said. "About that first spring," he said, "when I came to Caldwell." "What about it?" she said. "I was thinking that I didn't know what I was looking for," he said, in the way he always said things, low and unhurried. "And then I found it, and everything after that made sense." She looked at him, this 67-year-old man on his horse in the September dusk, with his silver hair and his creekwater eyes and the jaw she had loved for 38 years. "Everything," she said. "Everything that mattered," he said. She reached over the distance between the horses and he met her halfway, and they held hands in the September dusk over the land they had built on and the life they had built in it, and the cottonwoods made their sound, and the creek moved below, and the last light lay across the grass like something that had been given and not taken back. The years that followed were full years, as all theirs had been. James's practice grew into something that required a third doctor by 1925, and the doctor he hired was a woman, a young doctor named Elise from Wichita, which Frances considered the finest thing that had happened in Caldwell in some years, and celebrated with a dinner at which she talked for 90 minutes about the future with the same velocity she had talked about everything since the age of 9. Henry and Pearl added 2 more children to the 3 they had, and the ranch ran under Henry's hand with a competence that made Milton feel he had done his work well, which was exactly the right feeling for a man to have at the end of something he had built. James's William was growing up into a serious young man who had inherited his grandfather's quality of attention, and who spent summers on the ranch with Henry with the focus of someone who was deciding about his own future. Frances remained unmarried and untroubled by it, her life being by all observable measures exactly what she had meant it to be, and she was a woman of significance in Kansas education by the time she was 40, known for work that would continue to affect the teaching of children who learned differently for generations. On the evening of their 40th wedding anniversary, in October of 1923, Nellie and Milton sat on the porch of the house on the East Land with coffee and the sound of the creek, and around them the life they had made was present in all the ways a life is present, in the buildings and the land and the children and grandchildren and the whole accumulation of choices and days. 40 years, she said. Yes, he said. She looked at him and thought of the first time she had heard his voice. That Tuesday morning when she was 34 years old and life had been simpler and harder at the same time, and she thought that not every long story ends the way you hope it will when it begins, but some do, and the ones that do are worth more than they cost. Do you remember, she said, the day at the church social, when you came to stand beside me while Fitch was talking? Yes, he said. I thought, she said slowly, that you were the most composed person I had ever seen, that nothing you said ever had more heat in it than it needed to. I remember you asking me about that, he said. Later. You told me why, she said, and then you said something else. He looked at her, knowing perfectly well what she was about to say. You said I deserved a quiet kind of love, she said, that people deserve to feel safe in their own lives. I remember, he said. I want you to know, she said very carefully because some things require care, that you gave me that, every day of 40 years. You gave me a quiet kind of love and I was safe in it and I built everything inside that safety, the shop and the children and the book and everything, because of what you gave me. He was quiet for a long moment. The creek ran below the cottonwoods. Nellie, he said. Yes, she said. You gave me the same thing, he said. You need to know that too. She looked at him, and the October evening was around them, and she took his hand, and he held it with the same deliberate gentleness he had always held it with, because that was who he was, the man who moved through the world with quiet certainty and chose, every day, to treat the people he loved like the most important things in any room. They sat on the porch of the house he had built until the stars came out over Kansas, the same enormous sky, the same spilled universe, and they were both old enough now to know that time is not infinite and young enough in the things that matter to hold what they had with full attention. The light went from the western sky. The stars came on. The creek ran. And everything was exactly where it was meant to be.